You ever get that feeling? That creeping sensation like someone's watching you? I always thought it was just a thing that happened when you're walking home alone at night. A bit of paranoia playing tricks on your mind. But this was different. It all started on Halloween night. And looking back now, I should have known something was off. I had gone to a friend's party. You know, one of those small get-togethers where everyone knows each other. The same faces you see around the neighborhood. The vibe was chill, just people laughing, exchanging stories, but something about that night felt strange. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I just had this nagging feeling, like I needed to leave. So I did. The streets were quieter than usual, even for Halloween. I live in a pretty normal neighborhood. Decent houses, kids running around with their parents, but by the time I left the party, it was almost midnight. Everyone had gone inside. The decorations were still up, of course, jack-o'-lanterns flickering on porches, fake spider webs draped over fences, but everything was so still. Too still. That's when I saw him. At first I barely noticed. There was this guy, walking behind me. He was far back, so I didn't think much of it. People are out all the time on Halloween, right? But as I kept walking, I realized he was keeping pace with me. No matter how much I sped up or slowed down, he matched my rhythm. I could feel my pulse start to quicken, but I told myself it was nothing, just some random guy heading in the same direction. But then I glanced back. Just a quick look over my shoulder, and that's when I saw his mask. It was cheap, the kind you'd find in one of those last-minute Halloween stores. Plain white, with these hollow eyes that seemed to follow me, even from a distance. His clothes were nothing special either. Just a black hoodie, jeans, but it was the way he moved, so silent, so deliberate, that sent chills down my spine. I told myself it was nothing. You're overreacting, I thought. He's just walking home like you are. But every time I looked back, he was there. Same pace, same distance, same goddamn mask. By the time I turned onto my street, my heart was racing. I kept telling myself it was fine, that I was almost home, that nothing was going to happen. But then, as I reached my driveway, I made the mistake of looking back one more time. He had stopped, just standing there, at the end of the street, watching me. I felt frozen for a second, like my feet were stuck to the ground. Those hollow eyes, no, his eyes, were locked on me. He didn't move, he didn't say a word, just stared. My throat went dry, and for a moment, I couldn't even breathe. I don't know what snapped me out of it, but I bolted inside, slammed the door, and locked it. I rushed to the window, heart pounding, hands shaking, and peeked through the blinds. He was still there, but this time he wasn't standing still. He was walking away. Slowly, almost like he was taking his time enjoying the game. That's what it felt like, a game. But I didn't know the rules, and the worst part? I wasn't sure if it was over. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about those empty eyes behind the mask. The hours of that haunting night dragged on, stretching into an eternity woven with dread. Sleep, that sweet reprieve, was a cruel illusion, a distant land where nightmares festered. I lay wide awake, the oppressive weight of my thoughts pressing down upon me like a shroud of shadow, constricting my chest, suffocating my very breath. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside, transformed into a sinister symphony that echoed my deepest fears. In the bleak solitude of my room, I found myself wrestling with the specter of that masked figure, an insidious presence that haunted the recesses of my mind. His gaze, those hollow, haunting eyes, had pierced the very fabric of my sanity. I could still feel them on me, a tangible pressure, as though they had followed me home, burrowed into the corners of my consciousness. What malevolence lay behind that unyielding mask? Was he merely a remnant of my paranoia, a figment conjured by the darkness, or was he something far more sinister? The flickering light of my bedside lamp cast long, grotesque shadows across the walls, transforming mundane objects into twisted phantoms that danced mockingly. I could hear my heart, a relentless drumbeat in the silence, each thud a reminder of my vulnerability. My mind raced, torn between the rational and the irrational, each thought spiraling deeper into a well of despair. I should have felt safe, cocooned within the familiar confines of my home, yet every corner seemed to hide a lurking terror. As the night dragged on, I grappled with the suffocating silence, my senses sharpened to an excruciating degree. Every whisper of the night, The rustle of leaves, the distant howl of the wind, felt like an omen, a warning from some unseen force. I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone, that shadows were not merely shadows but sentient beings, waiting, watching, biding their time. Was it madness creeping in, or was there indeed something waiting to unveil itself? With every passing moment, the memory of the masked figure clawed its way back into my mind, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I replayed the scene in vivid detail, the way he had stood at the end of my street, a monument of malevolence, indifferent to my fear. How could he stand there, so calm, while I trembled in terror? It was a power play, a cruel reminder of my impotence in the face of an unnameable horror. Morning came, but with it brought no solace, only a pale light that seemed to mock my restless night. I dared to venture outside, the fragile facade of normalcy shattered by my harrowing experience. The sun cast a deceptive glow upon my neighborhood, illuminating the cheerful decorations that now seemed grotesque, as if they had been tainted by the darkness I had encountered. The laughter of children trick-or-treating echoed faintly in the distance, a stark contrast to the unease that gnawed at my gut. Whispers of the neighborhood murmured through the air, but they were tinged with an anxiety that had not been there before. The news of the vanished neighbor had spread like wildfire, a chilling reminder that darkness lurked just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. Faces that had once appeared friendly now seemed to harbor secrets, their smiles veiling a collective anxiety. I returned home, the air thick with an unspeakable tension. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that I was simply a victim of my own imagination. But as dusk began to settle, a creeping unease wrapped around me, tighter and tighter, until I felt I could scarcely breathe. I could almost hear the laughter of that masked specter echoing in my ears, a promise that the game was far from over. As I locked the door behind me, a shiver ran down my spine, the weight of impending dread bearing down once more. I could not shake the feeling that he was out there, waiting. And as darkness enveloped the world outside, I could only wonder, when would he return? And would I be ready for what awaited me? As the days morphed into a grotesque blend of mundane existence and lurking dread, I found myself caught in a web of anxiety that grew tighter with each heartbeat. Sleep became a foreign concept, my nights invaded by restless thoughts, and my days plagued by a relentless vigilance. I wandered through my home like a ghost haunting its own grave, each shadow a reminder of that masked figure, a specter of terror forever etched into my mind. The world outside moved with the indifferent rhythm of life, but I felt increasingly isolated, an exile in my own skin. I could hear the laughter of children drifting from the neighboring houses, their innocent joy clashing violently with the oppressive weight that settled on my chest. It was as if I existed in a parallel universe, one where horror lingered just beyond the threshold of comprehension, waiting to ensnare the unsuspecting. The morning news brought the latest grim updates, tales of neighbors who had vanished without a trace, each story punctuated by the same dreadful refrain, a mask found at the scene. My heart sank further with every chilling detail, twisting like a knife buried deep in my psyche. I had been so close to him. He had stood not far from my doorstep, a silent harbinger of doom. How could I have escaped his grasp? Was it mere luck, or something darker, some malevolent design? I spent my evenings peering through the window, scanning the shadows that crept along the street. Each rustle of leaves outside sent tremors of fear through me. I knew the face of terror now. I had seen it etched behind that mask, and I had been marked. My life had become a tapestry woven with the threads of paranoia, each moment tinged with the dread of what might come next. On a particularly oppressive night, I found myself ensconced in my chair, the dim light of the lamp casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. I clutched a worn book, but the words swam before my eyes, the text blurred by the weight of my racing thoughts. My mind was not my own. It was a battleground where reason and fear waged a constant war. As darkness swallowed the room, the silence deepened, wrapping around me like a shroud. Suddenly, a sound broke through the stillness, a soft tapping, barely perceptible like a whisper in the night. My heart leaped into my throat, each beat a drum roll heralding some unholy presence. I forced myself to breathe, but the air felt thick, charged with anticipation. I strained my ears, listening intently, every fiber of my being attuned to the slightest disturbance. The tapping grew louder, now accompanied by a low, indistinct murmur that clawed at the edges of my sanity. Was it a figment of my imagination? An echo of the torment that had taken residence in my mind? I rose slowly from my chair, the floor creaking beneath me, each step a test of my resolve. The sound came from the window. The very window I had watched so many nights before, where shadows danced and whispered secrets. I drew the curtain aside with trembling hands, my heart pounding like a war drum in my chest. The moonlight spilled into the room, illuminating the street outside. For a moment, I saw nothing but the desolate stretch of pavement, glistening under the pallid glow of the moon. But then, as if conjured by my own despair, there he stood, the masked figure, shrouded in darkness, at the edge of my driveway. Time seemed to slow as my breath caught in my throat, a visceral instinct urging me to retreat, to hide, to become one with the shadows. But my feet felt anchored to the ground, held captive by the icy grip of fear. He was closer than before, that sinister figure. His presence a malevolent force that pressed against the very fabric of my reality. In that moment, I felt the weight of inevitability settle upon me. I had danced with madness long enough. Now I stood at the precipice of something far more sinister. The stillness was suffocating, a taut string pulled to its breaking point. I wanted to scream, to shatter the silence that held me captive, but all that escaped my lips was a strangled whisper, a plea for understanding, a desperate cry for help. Yet he did not move. He simply stood there, a harbinger of dread, the embodiment of my deepest fears. And with his stillness, he spoke volumes. The game was not over. It had only just begun. And as I locked eyes with those hollow sockets, I realized I was no longer merely a victim. I was now part of a twisted narrative, entwined in a story that would lead to the depths of despair, or perhaps to the very edge of madness itself. In the nights that followed, I became a creature of shadows, slinking from room to room as if the very walls conspired against me. The air grew thick with an unshakable dread, and the quietude of my home became an echo chamber for my paranoia. I was haunted not just by that masked figure, but by the very act of living, every flicker of light and every distant sound morphing into an ominous herald of impending doom. I could feel the weight of those hollow eyes pressing against my back, an unseen gaze that watched my every move. The world beyond my window was but a memory, an echo of life I could no longer reach. I was a prisoner in my own home, my sanctuary turned fortress, each door locked tight as if it could stave off the encroaching darkness. Yet the irony was not lost on me. I had barricaded myself against a phantom, a nightmare incarnate that thrived in the shadows I had created. Days passed in a blur of anxiety, each morning a reminder of the night that had come before. I became obsessed with the sound of the ticking clock on the wall. Each second a taunt, a countdown to the inevitable return of that malevolent presence. The hands of the clock moved with a mocking slowness, as if time itself conspired to deepen my torment. I found solace only in the moments of twilight, when the fading light whispered promises of sleep, only to have those hopes dashed by the persistent return of my fears. I sought refuge in the fragile arms of routine, clinging to the mundane tasks that anchored me. Cooking became a ritual, each slice of a knife against the cutting board a cathartic release, yet the shadows danced in the corners of my kitchen, twisting the familiar into the grotesque. I would catch glimpses of movement, fleeting shadows that darted just out of view. It was a cruel trick of the mind, I told myself, a manifestation of my unraveling sanity. But reason and fear are strange companions, and in that silence the distinction between the two blurred. On one particularly harrowing evening, the darkness seemed to grow thicker, pressing against the windows like a living thing. I had spent hours perched on the edge of my bed, straining my ears for the slightest sound, convinced that the silence was a ruse. The tapping had returned, a relentless echoing against the walls of my mind. It was no longer a mere whisper. It had become a chorus of dread, resonating with my deepest fears. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone, desperate to distract myself from the encroaching shadows. I scrolled through social media, seeking solace in the lives of others. Yet what I found instead were posts warning of the masked figure that had become a specter in our community. Stay vigilant, they said. Do not go out alone. Each message was a dagger, twisting in my gut, reminding me of the danger that lurked just outside my door. As the clock struck midnight, a cold chill swept through the room, a harbinger of the horror that lay in wait. The tapping came again, insistent, a relentless summons that gnawed at my resolve. I moved to the window, heart racing, the curtains swaying as if beckoning me to peer beyond its veil. The moon hung high, a silent witness to my descent into madness, illuminating the street below. And there he was, the figure, at the edge of the pavement just as before, an immovable silhouette draped in darkness. I felt my breath hitch in my throat, a primal instinct urging me to retreat. Yet I remained paralyzed, caught in the web of fear that ensnared my mind. He did not advance, he merely stood, a monument to my terror, the mask reflecting the moonlight like a ghostly beacon. In that moment, I understood. This was not merely a game. It was an elaborate dance, a macabre waltz where I was both the marionette and the puppeteer. I was being drawn into a twisted narrative, one where the boundaries of sanity and reality blurred, and I felt the fraying threads of my mind slipping through my fingers like sand. I turned away, heart pounding, the walls closing in as the certainty of despair settled upon me like a shroud. In the end, it didn't matter if I was the hunted or the hunter. The very act of surviving had become its own form of torment. I was no longer merely afraid of him, I was afraid of what I might become. And as darkness descended once more, I was left to grapple with the chilling realization that the true monster might not be lurking in the shadows, but lurking within myself. As the moon cast its ghastly glow upon the world, I found myself ensnared in the final throes of my unraveling mind. The nights had become an endless torment, a cacophony of shadows and whispers that echoed my deepest fears. Each tick of the clock now felt like a death knell, counting down to an inevitable confrontation with the masked figure that had become my constant companion in dread. I spent my days lost in a fog of anxiety, the very air around me thick with unspoken terror. The walls of my home felt as if they were closing in, the familiar corners transforming into a labyrinth of darkness. Even the light of day had lost its warmth, replaced by a chilling pallor that seeped into my bones. I was a ghost haunting my own existence, a prisoner of my own making, tormented by the relentless specter of what awaited me outside. But one fateful night, driven by an unbearable weight pressing upon my chest, I resolved to confront my tormentor. The decision crystallized in my mind like ice, a moment of clarity amidst the chaos. I could no longer hide behind the fragile veil of denial. I had to face him. Perhaps in the act of confronting my fears, I could reclaim the fragments of my sanity that lay scattered like ashes in the wind. With a trembling heart, I moved to the window, drawn by an unseen force that compelled me forward. The moon hung high, illuminating the street below, casting eerie shadows that danced like phantoms. And there he was again, the figure in the mask, his silhouette as still as the grave. It was a scene so familiar, yet it felt like the first time I had truly seen him. I was acutely aware of the chill creeping up my spine, the very air around me vibrating with unspoken dread. "Show yourself," I shouted, my voice a trembling whisper against the oppressive night. "What do you want from me?" The question hung in the air, a fragile thread connecting us across the distance, a desperate plea for understanding. For a moment, the world stood still. The night was drenched in an oppressive silence, as if the universe held its breath in anticipation. And then, slowly, deliberately, the figure began to move. He took a single step forward, and my heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribcage. Was it madness that drove me to the edge of the window, or a desperate need to understand the horror that had consumed me? As he drew closer, the mask glinted in the moonlight, a hollow visage that seemed to absorb the light around it. My breath quickened, a visceral reaction to the impending confrontation. I could see the details now, the fabric of his clothing, the way the shadows clung to him like a second skin. My mind raced with questions, each one a jagged shard cutting into the fragile remnants of my sanity. Suddenly he stopped, standing just beneath the flickering streetlight, and for the first time I felt the weight of his gaze upon me. It was a piercing stare that seemed to strip away the layers of my defenses, laying bare my fears and insecurities. In that moment, I was not merely a victim. I was laid open, vulnerable to the world. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, the sound drowning out the world around me. "Why?" I rasped, my voice trembling on the precipice of despair. "What do you want?" The figure took another step forward, and with it, the world seemed to shift. In an instant, the mask fell away, revealing a face that was both familiar and foreign. It was the face of my own reflection, twisted and distorted, a grotesque mirror that reflected the very essence of my fear. "No," I whispered, realization crashing over me like a wave of cold water. This was not a monster lurking in the shadows. It was me, the manifestation of my darkest thoughts and insecurities. The terror that had plagued me was not an external force, but a darkness I harbored within. The figure stood before me, a silhouette of despair and hopelessness, and in that moment, I understood the truth of my existence. The horror was not in the mask or the figure, but in the fear I had allowed to consume me. I had become a prisoner of my own mind, shackled by the chains of my inadequacies and doubts. As I staggered back from the window, the realization settled upon me like a heavy shroud. I could feel the darkness receding, replaced by an unsettling clarity. I was free to step into the light, to embrace the uncertainty of life and the possibilities that lay ahead. But the journey would not be easy. I turned away from the window, leaving the masked figure behind, yet I knew that the echoes of that confrontation would remain. The shadows still lingered, and I would have to navigate the darkness that lay ahead. But in that moment, as the night enveloped me, I felt a flicker of hope ignite within, a small flame that could grow and push back against the encroaching darkness. Though the mask may have fallen, the journey was far from over. I was ready to confront whatever lay ahead, to walk the fine line between fear and freedom, to embrace the dance of shadows that weaves through the fabric of our existence. And perhaps, just perhaps, in the depths of that darkness, I would find the light I so desperately sought. As the night deepened and the last vestiges of twilight faded, I stood at the precipice of my sanity, teetering on the edge of comprehension and madness. The encounter with the masked figure had unraveled the very fabric of my understanding, and the revelation of my own face, a grotesque reflection, had carved a chasm of doubt within my mind. Had I truly confronted a specter of my own making, or had I merely succumbed to the madness that clawed at the edges of my consciousness? I turned away from the window, my heart racing, each beat resonating with the unsettling rhythm of confusion. The air in my home felt charged, electric with the remnants of fear and uncertainty. Shadows stretched and twisted along the walls, morphing into shapes that taunted me, blurring the line between reality and delusion. I grasped at the frayed threads of my mind, desperate to weave a narrative that made sense of the chaos surrounding me. As I retreated to the dim light of my living room, I tried to grasp the remnants of clarity that had momentarily sparked within me. I needed to understand what had transpired, to piece together the shards of this fractured reality. The ticking clock on the wall, once a harbinger of dread, now seemed like a mocking reminder of time lost to fear. I took a deep breath, steadying myself against the wave of anxiety that surged within. But then came a knock, a firm, deliberate rap against the front door. My heart seized in my chest, a visceral reminder of the fear that had dogged my every step. I felt the chill of terror creep up my spine once more, my breath quickening as the knock came again, louder this time. Was it him? Had the figure returned to claim me, or was it a cruel trick of my fraying mind? With trembling hands, I approached the door, the wood cold against my palm. I peered through the peephole, my pulse hammering in my ears. But all I saw was darkness, a void that swallowed the light, leaving nothing but uncertainty in its wake. The fear gripped me like a vice, threatening to crush whatever resolve I had managed to muster. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling, teetering on the brink of hysteria. There was silence, an unbearable pause that stretched endlessly, filled only by the sound of my heartbeat echoing in the stillness. I hesitated, grappling with the decision to open the door. My mind was a tempest of questions, swirling around in a chaotic dance. Was it real? Had I truly faced the manifestation of my darkest fears, or was it all a figment of my disturbed imagination? As if in response to my internal turmoil, the knock came again, this time accompanied by a low, haunting whisper that slipped through the cracks of the door. "Let me in." The words hung in the air, a chilling incantation that seeped into my bones. My breath caught in my throat as a chill washed over me, leaving behind a suffocating sense of dread. "Who are you?" I pressed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just a reflection," came the reply, a voice eerily similar to my own, but laced with a dissonance that sent shivers coursing through my veins. "A truth you have yet to accept." The world around me began to distort, the walls of my living room twisting and warping, echoing the turmoil that churned within my mind. I felt as if I were standing on the edge of a precipice, gazing into an abyss that threatened to swallow me whole. The shadows danced, taunting me, whispering secrets I could not decipher. In that moment, the line between reality and delusion blurred, and I was left to ponder the unsettling truth. What if I had never truly escaped the grip of madness? What if the figure I had confronted was not a mere reflection, but a harbinger of a deeper darkness that resided within me? The thought sent a jolt of fear coursing through my veins. With a surge of courage, I grasped the doorknob, my hand trembling as I turned it slowly, the mechanism clicking softly, a harbinger of the unknown. As the door creaked open, I was met with a rush of cold air that enveloped me, pulling me into the abyss that lay just beyond the threshold. And then I saw it, him. The figure stood there, but this time there was no mask, no shadow, just the reflection of my own eyes staring back at me, hollow and lost. A tremor ran through my body as the world around me faded into darkness, and the line between fear and reality dissolved completely. As I stood there, caught in that liminal space, I felt the chill of uncertainty wrap around me like a shroud. I was left to ponder the lingering question: was this the end, or merely the beginning of a descent into madness? And as the door swung wide, engulfing me in shadow, I felt the weight of my own fears descend upon me, a darkness that promised to consume, to echo in eternity, leaving me suspended in doubt, forever questioning what was real and what was merely a figment of a mind spiraling into despair. Thank you for joining me on this chilling journey through the shadows. If you enjoyed the story, please give a thumbs up and subscribe for more spine-tingling tales. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the story resonated with you the most? Don't forget to check out the video playing on the screen for more thrilling content. I pour my heart into these narrations, and your support means the world to me. Until next time, stay safe and keep the lights on.